Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I've just got Michael Gambon in at the start, just to give me a pep talk.
You're a bright young man. This monkey business is in your blood, under your skin. You're not getting out, you're just getting in. You're only getting started. I've every faith in you.
Oh, cheers, Michael.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, well, I've given away in the title, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of films. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those bits and bobs that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try really hard not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a movie off the ground, and really how grateful I am that movies do get off the ground as well. Cracking film to get us started on this episode as well. I'm going to take you back all the way to 1999. Let me just play you a clip of the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode, and then we'll get into the story the other side of this.
Try Mr. Wallace.
If we aired this segment,
I was told,
Don't talk.
mind my own business.
we could be a grave risk.
We're doing this with or without you, Lowell.
Are you a businessman or are you a newsman? He's only the key witness in the biggest public health reform issue in U.S. history. Does he go on television and tell the truth? Yes. Is it newsworthy? Yes. Are we gonna air it? Of course not. Why? Because he's not telling the truth? No, because he is telling the truth, and the more truth he tells, the worse it gets.
You manipulated me into this.
I fought for you, and I still fight.
The American public need to know.
Jeffrey!
And you wish you hadn't come forward?
Dr. Wagon's deposition will be part of this record.
You wish you hadn't blown the whistle?
Do I think it's worth it?
I told the truth. It's valid and true and provable.
These people, that's not the point whether you tell the truth or not.
And that was a clip from 1999's The Insider, directed by Michael Mann, written by Eric Roth and Michael Mann, based on the article The Man Who Knew Too Much by Marie Brennan, and starring Al Pacino, Russell Crowe, Christopher Plummer, Diane Venora, Philip Baker Hall, Lindsay Krause, and Debbie Mazur. And so in the story, in the game really of how on earth does this film get through the studio system, step up 1999's The Insider. 1999 had a couple of movies of this ilk that somehow made it through major international film studios. Fight Club from 20th Century Fox was the other. And in the case of the Insider, somehow this non-commercial drama really got a $68 million check from Disney to make it before even distribution costs. So we're going to dig into a little bit of just how that happened. Now, the key setup is a true story that took place in the 1990s, and it tells of a producer on the CBS television show in the US, 60 Minutes, by the name of Lal Bergman, and a whistleblower at a tobacco company, Brown and Williamson, part of British American Tobacco, called Jeffrey Wigand. Now, 60 Minutes was all set to air an interview with Jeffrey Wigand, who was blowing the whistle on practices that were undertaken by the aforementioned company. But let's just say matters took hold and got a little bit mucky and murky. And all of this was then outlined in an article that Vanity Fair published called The Man Who Knew Too Much, penned by Marie Brennan. So that was published in 1996. Now, in 1995, Michael Mann was riding high off the back of the release of his then latest film, Heat, at the end of the year, starring Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. And he was set to ink a deal with Disney for his next picture as well. Disney was coming through a transformative period, really, for its live-action cinema. In the early 1990s, the emphasis was on relatively modestly costed films, with the hope that a couple of them just break out. So, I mean, this was going on right through the 1990s as well, but films such as Cool Runnings broke through, George of the Jungle broke through. But Disney, under Jeffrey Katzenberg, when he was heading up the live-action side of the company, was almost at the point of putting a new Disney live-action film in cinemas every week or not far off it. Now, into the second half of the 1990s, as every other studio was investing heavily in blockbusters, Disney realised it was going to have to play that game. And so through its Hollywood Pictures arm, it was funding things like Con Air and The Rock. And Joe Roth had come in, a film director himself, the last time, in fact, a film director headed up one of the big studios. And he was looking to invest in a more expensive slate of movies. He wasn't looking to go absolutely gonzo with his spending, but he knew that for Disney to compete, they had to go a bit higher profile. So under Joe Roth's watch, for instance, films such as Armageddon were greenlit, and it created an environment where Michael Mann could potentially set up what would become The Insider. Now, Mann was friends with Lal Bergman, and the pair were in conversation as Michael Mann was editing Heat. And they were talking about what Lal Bergman was going through, trying to get this segment on a tobacco whistleblower aired on national television in the US, and the resistance for doing so. And then the Vanity Fair article came out, and Mann was suitably intrigued that there were interesting conversations here. The story of not airing the segment that had been recorded for a period of time for a start. Well, that was far more interesting than if the new segment concerned had gone out straight away. The contrasting characters at the heart of the story, that you had the whistleblower, Dr. Jeffrey Wigand, you had Al Pacino would come in ultimately as Lal Bergman, but these two men were polar opposites really, but unified by trying to get this story out. And so Mann was intrigued, and he got to a point where the rights were picked up for Brenner's article, and Michael Mann was looking at making that his next picture. In fact, as he would reflect to Vulture 2 decades after he made the film, what really motivated me was a real journey into the internal zones of these two people. He described Lal Bergman as unself-conscious and comfortable in his own skin. He's so centred, that's at the core of his ability to find out and get what he needs. And then contrasting that, the other guy is living within well-architected, constructed simulacrums of a life that he inhabits only a part of. Jeffrey Wigand has put himself in a state of contradiction in relation to how he should be perceived in his own mind. And it was that contrast. There were hooks here. Michael Mann was suitably intrigued, and it got to the point where he put a call in to Eric Roth. Now, Eric Roth at this stage in his career was a screenwriter, most notably known for Forrest Gump, for which he'd got the small matter of an Academy Award on his mantelpiece. But what had drawn Michael Mann to him was a then unmade script at the time called The Good Shepherd that Robert De Niro would ultimately film about the early days of the CIA. And so Mann brought Roth in for a conversation about co-writing a film based on the Man Who Knew Too Much article. And Roth admitted that, well, he had to have a good think about this. Talking to Brian Raftery for his excellent book, Best Movie Year Ever, he said, I was sceptical about whether I was the right guy. He said, I'd never done this docudrama kind of writing. It was also research-based and fact-based, and you couldn't dick around with that, he argued. Because what they were also conscious of is, number one, this was a live topic. Number two, they were talking about a major tobacco company that it would be fair to anticipate would not be shy in giving their lawyers a phone call should things go slightly awry. And so what Roth and Mann realised they had to do was base the story that they were going to tell largely on records that were already publicly available. And Michael Mann would be described as compiling volumes of research. Again, this is going back to Brian Raftery's book, which he would keep in 3 ring black binders that covered his office shelves. He went absolutely forensic on making sure he had the facts of this straight in his head. And Mann and Roth got into a writing process. They'd meet 3 days a week starting in early 1997 at a deli in Santa Monica, and they would both talk and work the movie out. They would both smoke as well, although over time the pair of them would kick the habit. Now, in the midst of all of this was the news anchor of 60 Minutes, a man called Mike Wallace, very well known in the US, not very well known outside of the US, where I'm sat now. And Wallace would occasionally check in as well, even as the real-life story still continued to play out. So Dr. Jeffrey Wigand, for instance, was only reaching a legal settlement in the middle of 1997 that would de-gag him a little bit and allow him to tell more of his story. And when that happened, Wigand was able to be cooperative in the movie, but he did have certain conditions in making sure his story came across. Number one, he wanted to be clear that nobody was to be seen smoking on screen in the film, which didn't seem an unreasonable request, not least the fact that he was a tobacco whistleblower and the contents of his whistleblowing. Well, if you're familiar with the film, you're familiar with his story, you'll know why he was particularly resistant to this. He also wanted Michael Mann to change one area of his personal life, that he'd be going through a divorce, apparently not a particularly easy divorce, so he wanted the identity of his ex-wife changed, and that wasn't a problem either, but it meant that the supporting character in the film of Leanne Wigand was pretty much fictionalised for the purposes of the drama. As 1997 rolled on, though, Roth and Mann were continuing to pen the script until it was the time to make the decision that Mann went into Disney, went to Joe Roth, and presented him with the Untitled Tobacco Project, as the film was known at that point. And already at this stage, the project was known about, even though it hadn't been given a green light, that there wasn't a studio absolutely committed to making it. It was known that Michael Mann was going to take on a tobacco whistleblower story, and already there were elements of contention circling around that. It's such a risky film to make. What would happen if one of the companies concerned became particularly litigious? Would any studio really want to touch it? There were a million reasons why they wouldn't want to go near it. And also there was the slight political note that 60 Minutes was a CBS production, and Disney owned a rival television network, and still does, rival television network ABC. And so would Disney want to fund potentially a film that was directly criticising the practices of what was seen as one of its competitors? Then, just to add a further complexity in there, the integrity of journalists was part of the story that they wanted to tell as well. And journalists, of course, have a habit for being incredibly thick-skinned and deflecting criticism with no problem whatsoever. So alarm bells all over, really. Lots and lots of reasons to say no. And as noted in the Best Movie Year Ever book, there's this unwritten rule that broadcasters and Hollywood studios don't make movies or documentaries that attack one another. And it argues that in the old days, you never saw Paramount make a movie that makes 20th Century Fox look bad. And there was a real genuine chance that people would interpret the film The Insider, as it was becoming known, as ABC and Disney just taking aim at their rivals. However, Mann and Eric Roth insisted that wasn't the case. That wasn't the story that they were looking to tell. They also knew that the script was going to be vetted heavily, heavily, heavily by Disney's lawyers, and they were happy that the story that they were telling was going to stand up to the required levels of scrutiny. It was down to Joe Roth. Joe Roth now had to make the decision, is Disney going to gamble on this? A film that other Hollywood studios were not queuing up to make. However, they were queuing up to make a film with Michael Mann. Heat had been a dream project for Warner Brothers in the end, that it had made money, it had earned acclaim, and it was a very simple pitch, as I've covered before on a previous episode of this podcast. So Michael Mann went in, and Joe Roth said to him, is this film going to make money? Michael Mann said to him, no, probably not. And Roth is quoted as saying, what does that say? Cluck it, let's make it anyway. And noting that Disney's lawyers were going to have a line-by-line interest in the script, Michael Mann had his green light, and The Insider was now to be his next film. So it was on to casting, and straight away he dug into potentially one of the ensemble from Heat, Val Kilmer. He was an early suggestion for the key role of Jeffrey Wigand in the film. Didn't quite work out, and it was producer Peter Jan Bruger who had what would turn out to be one of the eureka moments when it came to casting the movie, because he'd just been watching Curtis Hanson's film LA Confidential, which was a breakthrough role for an upcoming actor called Russell Crowe. Now, Crowe had already come onto the radar through Romper Stomper, which remains a very arresting piece of Australian cinema, but this was him jumping into a Hollywood production and more than holding his own. Now, Crowe was in Canada at this point filming the movie Mystery Alaska, and he'd had to get into shape for that film, very physical film. But he was on people's radar, and he was sent. A call went in, would you fly from Canada to come over to meet Michael Mann in Los Angeles? And so they met for a 2-3 hour chat, and he was in the room with Michael Mann talking about playing Jeffrey Wigand. But also, Crowe didn't really feel that he fit the role, that Crowe was much older than the man he was being asked to play. He looked very different as well, and in truth there was an element of doubt as to just why he was there at all. Michael Mann was having not dissimilar thoughts in his head as the story goes, and so it was kind of feeling each other out a little bit until Crowe got to a key speech in the text that made Mann instantly think he'd got his man. He just captured what he wanted from the on-screen depiction of Jeffrey Wigand, and Russell Crowe was now the absolute top choice for the role. There was a consideration, could Russell Crowe really commit to it and transform himself physically for the part? And so Crowe said, yeah. And he put forward that he would eat a lot of cheeseburgers, he would drink a lot of bourbon, and he would sit on a sofa for a good month and a half just watching footage of Jeffrey Wigand, just so he could capture his mannerisms and capture his character. Now, Mann also went back to Heat, wanting Al Pacino back as well. And Pacino was one of many Americans who'd grown up watching Mike Wallace on the television. He agreed to join the film, Pacino, not Mike Wallace, knowing he was walking into something that might prove on the contentious side. Christopher Plummer, meanwhile, had actually been interviewed by Mike Wallace and hadn't really enjoyed the experience. And now, at Al Pacino's suggestion, he was put forward as a potential to play him. Mann would agree to this, and Plummer was duly hired as well. And Plummer was also offered the opportunity to meet Wallace and have a conversation about the part, but he turned that down. He was pretty adamant about not wanting to meet. Diane Verona, who'd taken a role in Heat as well, she was hired to play Wigand's wife in The Picture, Leanne. She went off to Louisville to research her character, to mix with people in that area of the state. And come the spring of 1998, the cast for what was going to be a very weighty film was assembled. The cast were deep in the levels of research that Michael Mann was pretty well known for, and Crowe was in shape. He had shaved back his hair. He had dyed his hair as well. He'd eaten the requisite number of cheeseburgers as well. And ahead of shooting beginning, Crowe and Mann spent just shy of 2 months together, talking things through and just working things out and getting into a position where they knew what this film was, what this character was, and how to move things forward. Now, that shoot took place over several months. It started in May of 1998, and it involved quite a lot of travelling around the US and the Bahamas as well. There was a brief stop-off in Israel, and as Michael Mann said, that Al Pacino's presence, particularly in Israel, created what was described as, quote, a near riot. He said that when they found out he was there, we had 2,000 kids racing around, and basically they had to smuggle him back out of town. Mann's directorial style, well, he was in an interesting position here, that as much as he had the pressure of Disney's money, what Disney's money afforded him was the space really to make his film, because $68 million is a good chunk of change, particularly in the 1990s, when your film doesn't have action sequences, doesn't have special effects, you don't need to fly helicopters in left, right and centre. He was filming a tense, taut drama. Already parallels were being drawn with films such as All the President's Men. And what this meant was that Mann could take as many takes as he needed, really, to capture the characters, to capture the footage that he was after, leaving his actors sometimes just wondering what it was that Mann was looking for. But Mann knew. He knew what he was after. I mean, for instance, the character of Jeffrey Wigand, Mann wanted an internal performance from Russell Crowe, really. He wanted him to capture the awkward mannerisms of Wigand in real life. On the flip side of that, Wigand, a martial arts expert at one point, so Crowe had to go off and do martial arts training as well. But he wanted the intimacy of it all, that Mann was willing to film his actors very close up. He was deliberately not looking to make a documentary, but he wanted to get metaphorically, to be clear, inside the characters, and as such he was shooting this as up close and personal as he could. There was a lot of location filming, but one particular part of the film that you might assume is a set actually isn't, is the courtroom, where a key deposition sequence takes place in the film. And this is cited in Jackson County, Mississippi, in the story of the movie. As it turns out, the filmmakers were able to use the actual courtroom where the real events took place as well. And so that lent another slice of the kind of authenticity that Michael Mann was looking for from his film. And the production would wrap up in October of 1998. And Russell Crowe, for one, was very, very happy to be able to escape a character that had taken over his life for many, many months of time. he would talk about how Michael Mann was talking to me about this next shot, and he said, I've never felt this before, but I am over this character. I have had enough. And so Michael Mann gave him a hug, let Russell Crowe go once he captured the final shot of the performance, and Crowe promptly went to New Orleans. He got drunk, he sang karaoke. I'm unaware just what songs he sang, although it'd be quite interesting to find out just what Russell Crowe sings at karaoke. And then he went off to a health retreat to get back into shape because he had a film called Gladiator not far round the corner. And so into post-production. Now, I've talked about a couple of Michael Mann films on this podcast before, films such as Heat, films such as Last of the Mohicans as well. And one of the constant themes is just how speedy his post-productions tend to be. Certainly if you look at the contracted amount of time it took him to get Heat into shape. And this is a byproduct of the fact that Michael Mann spent a good chunk of his career working in television on shows such as Miami Vice, where the pressure was on to turn around the episode at alarming speeds. And so Michael Mann was in that rhythm. He knew once he got to the editing room, things had to speed along. This would be a slight exception, though, because it'd be a very complex film just to knit together. And for a while, Mann had 3 different editors working on it at the same time. It would take in the end 14 months to nail the final cut of the picture, and as Cinemontage reports in an excellent piece on its website, Bill Goldenberg was the lead editor. He was working on it for a year. Paul Rubel was working on the film for 14 months, and initially David Rosenblum was hired as well. He did the first 5 months of editing on the film. He stepped away at the end of 1998 when Mann narrowed the room down to 2 editors. He thought that 3 was probably too many. Mann was also changing his approach just slightly from how he'd been on Heat, where he'd had multiple editors on that as well. And in the making of Heat, he was very prescriptive about who was going to edit which sequence. Less so really with The Insider. And as Goldenberg said, that Michael Mann would come in and he'd watch daily footage, 8 hours at a stretch, commenting on every line, taking it all in, not missing a thing, remembering moments like the way the light hit Russell Crowe's eye in a certain take. He would just remember it months later. And so the editors took the footage in turn, really. Whatever was due to be cut together next, they worked it that way, that they didn't overly formalise it, and whatever needed doing next, as soon as an editor had some free time, they picked up the material and got to work. Goldenberg would also add that Michael Mann has the unique ability to watch the movie every other day and see it as fresh as anybody I've ever seen. He said he's able to look at it like he's just seen it for the first time or hadn't seen it in a long time. And he described it too as a unique ability to maintain distance when you see the movie 4 or 5 times a week. Now, Michael Mann had lots of notes, as you would expect. He'd be very precise about the kind of film he was looking to put together. But over the course of those 12-14 months, the final cut was coming in, and it was coming in at a weighty 158 minutes. Now, all that was the quiet part of the post-production, the behind closed doors, where the filmmaker's able to make the film and to put together the cut of the film that they want. But the build-up to the actual release, which Disney had pegged now for November the 5th, 1999, became less about the tobacco industry, which had been the big fear going into the movie, and Disney still was worried that it would face a lawsuit for the film. But it would become more about unhappy journalists and the way that they were portrayed in the film. And in particular, going back to Mike Wallace, the anchor of 60 Minutes, during the build-up to the release window of the film, and also during the release window itself, Mike Wallace was very present and vocal over what he felt and argued were the inaccuracies in it. And this was such a huge surprise to Eric Roth, who admitted that he was completely taken aback by this. He just described it as the biggest shock of my life, because what he thought he was seeing was, what he thought they'd made, was a story exposing corruption, a story of the lengths people go to cover things up. And Eric Roth just said, we'd written a love letter to journalists and they attacked us. And The Insider all of a sudden had this massive target almost printed on it. Now, when it went in front of critics, I mean, the reviews were outstanding. I mean, heart on sleeve here, I think the Insider is an absolutely fabulous film, a real grown-up drama, and it remains a miracle that it somehow got through the studio system. They were, 1999, appreciating, was already a very, very strong year for films. In fact, one of the reasons Brian Raftery's written his book, which I've cited a few times over the course of these podcast episodes, is because it was such a freak year for high-quality material. I think The Insider stands side by side with pretty much anything that was released that year, including my personal favourite, Magnolia. And the reviews were just what they were looking for. Now, the problem they had was because it was effectively a media story that it was going out as, that was only going to play in a limited number of markets, really, in the US. Would people in the south of America, for instance, be interested in people arguing on the west and east coast of America about whether something should or shouldn't air on the television? Now, that wasn't really what the film was ultimately at heart about, but that was certainly the narrative that was coming out of it. And there was a genuine fear that it was going to hurt the box office, which already it was looking like a long shot that Disney would get its money back on the picture. What it was gunning for was a big Oscar race, but it still needed some degree of momentum behind it. And when the film opened on November the 5th to the 7th that weekend in the US, well, it didn't really get it. It opened in 4th place with an opening of $6.7 million. Not a brilliant screen average either. Disney had put it out on 1,800 screens, that it hadn't done the thing of slowly curating an awards release and building up the screen count. It got in with quite a high number. And of the 3 new releases out that week, it finished bottom of them. Top of the box office chart was the first of the new releases, The Bone Collector, starring Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie, 16.7 million. Pretty tidy thriller that is as well, and far more commercial. House on Haunted Hill had been out for a week. That knocked down to 2nd place. Chris O'Donnell in The Bachelor, a film that kind of came and went very, very quickly, with 7.4 million, was in 3rd place. And The Insider was struggling pretty much from the off. I mean, it dropped out of the top 5 the week after, as films such as Pokemon the First Movie, Dogma, The Messenger, The Story of Joan of Arc, and Anywhere But Here all came along. And of those, only Pokemon was really doing significant business. By week 3, James Bond was out, The World Is Not Enough, Sleepy Hollow was about, The Insider was struggling. In fact, it was barely holding in the top 10 by the end of November, which for an Oscar-running film and an awards-running film was not really what they needed. Films such as End of Days and Toy Story 2 were instead making an awful lot of money. And whilst The Insider held on to a little bit of business, by the time it left US cinemas, this film that had cost Disney nearly $70 million just to make, before distribution, before striking all the prints, was at 29 million, and it wasn't going to budge much further than that. Outside of America, I mean, it did tidy business, 31 million, which an overall worldwide gross of $60.2 million. But for a company of Disney's size, that wasn't what it was gunning for. And it never really took off in the way that all concerned would have hoped. What it did do was earn significant amounts of acclaim. In fact, the Oscars were very interested, giving it 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay as well, cinematography from Dante Spinotti, the editing, the sound. Absolutely none of them walked away pretty much empty-handed. And in fact, from most of the awards, it walked away empty-handed. I mean, the most significant prize it got was Best Film from the Los Angeles Film Critics Association, but there was so much other rich choice around at that point that The Insider just was hit by an awful lot of bad luck, really. Too many really good films were competing in and around it. And so it was a case of Oscar nominations not really helping the film, as Entertainment Weekly reported that it was just, even though it was up for Best Picture, it was just not budging the money that was coming in the tills. And as Michael Mann said as well, Disney had bought a lot of television ad time to promote the film, but it didn't quite know how to sell it. And how do you sell it? 2.5-hour drama about a tobacco whistleblower. And as Michael Mann said to Entertainment Weekly, I don't think there was a message coming across in 30-second spots that stuck to the wall. I don't think people knew what the film was about. And as such, when you got people like Mike Wallace who had the microphone, who were talking more loudly about it, that was the message that was coming across, not actually the material that was in the cut of the film. As The Insider kind of fizzled out a little bit, Michael Mann was juggling his next project. He was going to do, even though he didn't confirm it just at that point, a biopic of Muhammad Ali, which he would go on to make with Will Smith. But The Insider and also Fight Club, which I'm coming to in a future episode of this podcast, remain these outliers, really, of studio cinema in the late 90s and the 2000s, of an absolute swing on a film that surely they must have known they had precious little chance of getting their money back on, but they made it anyway because they just thought it might be a really good film. Case of The Insider, it's not widely seen. It should be widely seen. It is one of Michael Mann's best movies, and that is not something I say lightly. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for your time and thank you for listening. I'm going to crack on just with the parish notice segment of the podcast. For instance, if you like this podcast, there are 3 ways. I'd really appreciate if you can support it in any of these ways. It would just be wonderful. If you can subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, that costs you absolutely nothing. Likewise, leaving ideally a hugely positive review. That costs you absolutely nothing as well. If you do want to spend a bit of money, then head over to Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you put some coins in there, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well. You find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes and all sorts of mischief. There's a lot going on that we're going to be able to talk about soon. Then also we produce print magazines, and issue 44 of Film Stories is at the printers at the moment. By the time this podcast is out, it should have arrived back from the printers. We lead with a big interview with Emily Blunt talking about Oppenheimer and a lot more. I also spoke to Christopher Nolan for the latest issue, and we get into the insecurities of filmmaking, which I don't think he talks about an awful lot. So really quite pleased with all the stuff we've managed to put in there. If you're interested in buying a copy of that and helping support us, we're at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode. I'm coming out to Britain, coming back close to home for me. Let me thus transport you back to 2004 this time. As always, I'm going to play a little bit of a clip from a trailer, and then I'm going to tell you the story, the other side of it.
Oh. You're not in there because I like you.
I'm not a gangster. I'm a businessman, giving people what they want. Long live the king.
You're a smart boy, but you keep very bad company.
We work to a few golden rules.
3 million done.
Keep a very low profile. Never be too greedy.
You know what? People like you can't leave this business because you make too much money for people like me.
But I've always said, quit while you're ahead.
I want my cargo.
Just give me a day.
I am the target.
He's lopping people's heads off. I will be watching you. You're gonna need one of these.
When I hate guns.
That was a bit of Daniel Craig just at the end there, playing a character who hated guns. The future for Daniel Craig might have a few more guns in it. That was a clip from Layer Cake, directed by Matthew Vaughn, screenplay by J.J. Connolly, based on his book of the same name, and starring Daniel Craig, Cole Meany, Kenneth Cranham, George Harris, Jamie Foreman, Sienna Miller, Michael Gambon, and an awful lot more people who I'll come to throughout the course of this story as well. And so let's talk about Matthew Vaughn, who come the start of the 2000s was a film producer, wasn't a film director. He was primarily producing movies for Guy Ritchie. They'd had a breakthrough smash with Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels towards the end of the 1990s. And then in 2000, the film Snatch, his third as producer, became an international smash hit. It attracted Brad Pitt to the ensemble as well. And so he would work with Guy Ritchie again on 2002 Swept Away, also co-starring Madonna, and he had a remake of Mean Machine on his slate as well. But he and Ritchie for a little while were planning a further gangster film by the name of Layer Cake that was based on a novel initially by writer J.J. Connolly. In fact, it was by writer J.J. Connolly that Vaughn had been vaguely aware of just as he was heading off to the Euro 2000 football championships and to a game taking place in Belgium between England and Germany. And so he got on a train to journey to the football match concerned and found himself sat next to, wouldn't you know it, J.J. Connolly. And the pair of them got chatting, and Vaughn and Connolly talked about Layer Cake and became aware of each other and their projects. And so once Vaughn got home, he dug out a copy of the novel and read it and thought, well, this is the next project. This is one I want to do. And as Connolly explained, he said it was a novel really about watching a lot of people getting it very wrong. That he argued that only very stupid people think criminals are stupid, and a lot of text treats criminal businessmen as total idiots. And so he wanted to take a slightly different spin on it, and he said he described how he wrote a short story about the unnamed lead character, which then grew and grew and grew into what became Layer Cake. And he said, once I told people I was writing it, guys would tell me stories telling me I was getting it right. And so there was an undercurrent of authenticity to the kind of tale that he was spinning as well. And Vaughn, coming back from Belgium, he quickly got in touch and wanted to pick up the movie rights, to which Connolly agreed to sell him as well. And Connolly was also going to write the screenplay for the film. Now, at this stage, Connolly hadn't written a screenplay for a film before, and so he produced, in the end, a document that ran to around 400 pages. Now, the standard rule of thumb when writing a screenplay is 1 page of screenplay equates to 1 minute of screen time. And so 400 pages, that's a good 6.5 hours of film. So that clearly wasn't going to work. But Matthew Vaughn was working with producers Adam Bowling and David Reed as well. And they sat down too with J.J. Connolly and started sculpting it all down to a manageable length, all with the view that Guy Ritchie was going to direct the resultant script. So with the script coming along, it was over to Ritchie, but Ritchie at this point was having other ideas. He was taking a bit of a tabloid battering as a result of elements of his personal life and his marriage, and also Swept Away had hardly gone down a treat. That is no understatement whatsoever. And so he was looking at shifting direction a little bit, and he would be lured away to work with Luc Besson on a new gangster film called Revolver, which would feature Jason Statham again. And so Matthew Vaughn was left with this film, this project really that he developed, thinking that Guy Ritchie would step in and direct. And now Guy Ritchie wasn't going to do it. So what do? You've got a couple of choices here. You can find another director, you can drop the project altogether, or you can go with the option he ultimately did. And so Vaughn just said in the end, I'd already done so much to develop it, he explained to Phase 9. I did not want to hand it over to somebody else who'd probably mess it up. So I decided to do it myself. He was going to make his directorial debut, a first-time director on a British gangster movie that was in the wheelhouse, really, of what they'd made before, but also would take a couple of slightly different turns and would put a whole group of people off doing the ironing. If you've seen the film, you know. So Vaughn's reputation as a producer did mean that the project was garnering interest, that it was going to be able to get its funding together. $6.5 million is the given budget for the film. And so he had actors who were interested in coming to join it. And as Vaughn recalled, a lot of very good actors wanted it. But then also a very good actor, this fella called Daniel Craig, was interested. Now, Daniel Craig in the early 2000s was not James Bond. Instead, he was the bloke who took on a supporting role in the Tomb Raider film. He'd been in The Road to Perdition. He'd scored a bit of a coup by being cast in Steven Spielberg's Munich as well. That was due out a year or two later down the road. But he was riding high off the acclaim for a couple of British films he'd done, The Mother and Enduring Love, both of which are terrific films. And so Vaughn said, I met with Daniel, and what he wanted to do with the movie was what I wanted to do with it. And his reservations about being in this film were my reservations about making the movie. And Vaughn was very, very aware that people would just assume he would be retreading previous ground, but he said, I didn't want to do another Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch. I wanted to try and do a film which, although it's in the same vein, it's a totally different piece. And Daniel Craig was very much supportive of that approach. That's what Craig wanted as well. And so he signed on the dotted line, meaning the rest of the cast could come together too. Now, one challenge in the ensemble, I played a clip from him right at the very start, was casting Michael Gambon in a small part in the picture, because Michael Gambon at this point had taken over from Richard Harris as playing Dumbledore in the Harry Potter films, and the Harry Potter schedule was constant and demanding. That for a decade in the UK, Harry Potter was a magnet for a lot of talent and a lot of filmmaking resources, and Gambon had to fit in his other projects around when he had to pop back off to the studio and put his wizard outfit back on. Still, they found a small gap in his schedule. Gambon agreed to sign up. And also, what's interesting about Layer Cake, looking at it, is the number of small supporting roles that are given to people who would go on to do really interesting things. So while you've got Sienna Miller on the one hand, while you've got Cole Meany, you also get an early performance from Sally Hawkins, and you get a young Ben Whishaw as well, who'd just done Hamlet at this point. Dexter Fletcher, an old colleague of Matthew Vaughn's as well, he agreed to come in and just shoot effectively a cameo part for the film, and Layer Cake was pretty much ready to go. Filming would thus get underway in the summer of 2003, and it was a 10-week shoot for the production as well that was split. There was 3.5 weeks in a studio in Twickenham, 6.5 weeks on location in London. In fact, there was a little bit more time as well because they popped off to Holland just to get a couple of shots too. And Vaughn was very much a first-time director, and some of that inexperience was cropping up in pre-shooting rehearsals. That Vaughn said, I had troubles the first day in rehearsal with Daniel Craig. And he said, I'd watched Guy Ritchie a lot, and Guy's very pedantic about how lines should be read. So he does line reading to the level of 8 people, telling 8 people where pauses should be, and so on. Now, Vaughn tried a little bit of this and said, I got told off by Daniel for line reading, which I thought was the normal way of doing it. But he said that was also the only faux pas I really made. And as Daniel Craig said, he just asked me things. He said he's not precious about what he does. He asked me questions. And if I saw him doing something that I thought wasn't the best way to talk to an actor, I'd go and tell him. And he was like, good, tell me. He was unprecious about his ego. Vaughn was also realistic as well, that he wasn't a full-on film nerd here, that he certainly had his touch points of films that he knew, and he felt it was wise to surround himself with a lot of experience. Now, the touch points, the directorial touch points, were films by the likes of Brian De Palma, and wouldn't you know it, Michael Mann. But he also knew he was going to shoot in London, and what he didn't want was a style over substance film, but he did want to hit the streets of London. He did want to show parts of the city. And at the start of production, he would surround himself by experienced crew and people who really knew how to get a film over the line. A wise plan in his case as well, because it allowed him to focus on the story he wanted to tell and learn more and more about directing as he went along. He also knew, the producer side of him also knew, that different parts of London are controlled by different councils, and different councils in London offer different levels of friendliness to film crews. And so Vaughn, the producer, was targeting the areas of the city who were friendlier and more accommodating to a crew rocking up on their doorstep. And Craig also was asked as part of the shoot to stand on top of a very tall building. Without going spoilery on this, he would reflect on this to Phase 9, because he did this, he actually did the stunt, and he just said it was terrifying, although they used a harness. And he said, I'm so scared of heights, but there were all these tough stuntman types around, so I just went and did it. And he described how there was all this scaffolding around, so we had to climb up ladders for part of the way, and then we spent most of the day up there. I don't get the impression it was one of his favourite days of filming as an actor. He also discussed with IGN the idea that the character that he plays in the film is never actually named. In fact, he's listed as XXXX, which is 1 X away from Vin Diesel, if you think about it. And Craig said, we kind of thought about names, but you know the thing about it, if you were doing a more conventional movie, what's in a name, he argued. He says, you hear a name repeated 3 or 4 times at the beginning of a movie, you kind of forget about it. And he said, as long as you know who the lead character is, what they're doing, then it's sort of not that relevant, is it? And he described his character as someone who wants to remain anonymous. That's his deal. He doesn't want to make noise. And so he and Vaughn agreed that this guy that he was playing, the lead character in the film, was not going to be actively named. As it turned out, even though large chunks of the shoot took place outside of the studio complex as well, the toughest part of it was when they came into the studio and onto sound stages. It's usually completely reverse of that. When you're shooting a movie, that you can control the elements when you're on a sound stage, you're a little bit more in control just of the sound and making sure things are noise proof, and that you're in an environment that's set up for making films. The bit that they hadn't really banked on was the summer of 2003 was blisteringly hot, and wouldn't you know it, the 3.5 weeks that they were scheduled to shoot in studio space in Twickenham was the point where the temperature rocketed. The studio also had no air conditioning as well, and so it was by distance the least comfortable bit of a shoot, which was going really quite quickly. Appreciating that they had just over 2.5 months to get the film, Vaughn was still going at speed. At one point he was said to have gone through around 20 different sets in 2 weeks. Such was the pace that he was getting the footage that he needed. He was also very keen during the physical production of the film to make sure that the violence had a different look and feel to the likes of Lock, Stock and films of that ilk, that there were a lot of British gangster films around at that point, the Lock, Stock imitators, and he didn't want to do that. He wanted to make sure that his film would have an identity that was notably different, that would also, as it turned out, involve the use of an iron, which I mention it twice because, my God. Anyway, he got to a point where the film headed into post-production. It was in the can come the back end of 2003. John Harris was editing the picture, and he's worked with Danny Boyle an awful lot and also directed The Descent Part 2. He would go on to work with Matthew Vaughn on Stardust, for instance. He would also be on Kick-Ass and a bunch of other films. And so there no great drama that came out in the post-production element of Layer Cake. That the film was readied. It was heading for release as well in the UK, first of all, on the 1st of October 2004. And hopes were relatively modest, but still not too bad for it. It went out in front of critics too, who were really quite positive about it. Again, appreciating the context here, there were a lot of imitators, that gangster films were the thing at this point in British cinema, and yet Layer Cake got praise for finding something in the midst of it all that just worked. In particular, the casting of Daniel Craig really paid off, and unbeknownst to Daniel Craig at that point, amongst the people watching Layer Cake were Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, who were looking to cast the next James Bond, and it's said that one of the indirect to direct results of his performance in Layer Cake is it helped land him the James Bond role. By 2000, but within a year or two he was making Casino Royale and starting his legacy as 007. The reviews were strong enough too that they generated some awards attention, that Matthew Vaughn was nominated as Most Promising Newcomer as a director at the BAFTAs, and it was the British Independent Film Awards that put forward a gong for it as well. It didn't take anything really home, but still the critical response to it was relatively strong, and the audience response to it wasn't bad either, that the film was able to pick up an American release. It was in the UK where it did the bulk of its business, didn't go absolutely great guns or anything like that, and certainly in the US, it kind of came and went a little bit, as quite a lot of British gangster films did, that it opened in the US. Sony Pictures Classics agreed to put it out, opened in the US quite some time later, in May of 2005, the weekend of the 13th to the 15th, opened on 10 screens with a really good screen average, but 10 screens isn't really going to get you particularly high up the chart, finished in 35th as films like Monster in Law, Kicking and Screaming and Unleashed dominated the top of the chart. In terms of expanding the release of Layer Cake, well, it was a slow process. That the screen count gradually went up the following week, and thus the film went up to 26th place as Revenge of the Sith landed in cinemas. By its third week of release, it was clear it wasn't going to go completely nuts, but the screen count kept coming up. It broke into the top 20 just about. And then for week 4, Layer Cake's bubble had pretty much quickly burst, that its US gross would be $2.3 million. Outside of the US, primarily in the UK, it made about 6 million pounds in the UK. And so it was a solid hit, and also DVD and Blu-ray was accommodating enough that it would make a fair amount of money on home formats too, and continues really to just tick along. It pops up on streaming services, it pops up as a relatively regular film to watch, and it does get its eyeballs on it, not just because it's got a lot of very early James Bondy actors in there, as well as just turn up roles for the likes of the brilliant Bern Gorman. You get Jason Fleming in the mix as well, and it's Tom Hardy, I should note too, I didn't mention him before. You get very young Tom Hardy, just in the era where he was Star Trek villainy. That was where Hardy's career was roughly at that point. For Matthew Vaughn, what this would launch would be a new phase of his career. He would talk about how he'd found his calling a little bit, that he said, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed directing, to be frank. He said, I had a really good time. He said, it was fun. It didn't feel like work ever, so that was what was surprising for me. He would also reflect to Phase 9 that I made the film I planned to make, but I'm surprised by the positive reactions to the film. And I was glad that what works so well in my mind has been appreciated. And he said it's especially glad because it's something that I'm proud of. He'd gone out of his comfort zone and he'd become a movie director. And there was no going back, really. Because, again, as he would reflect to IGN, he said it was hard to get used to saying cut, but as a producer, I'd be thinking it, but I wouldn't be able to say it. And he said, it sounds really crazy, but directing is not as difficult as people say it is. That what it meant here was that Vaughn would reflect that it changed him a little bit as a producer as well. And it would open up a directorial career that continues to this day. That he would go on to do Stardust in 2007, Kick-Ass 2010, X-Men First Class would follow 2011 before launching the Kingsman films, of which there have been 3 to date, reportedly with a 4th there as well on the way, and would keep the producing going, but with a slightly different frame of mind. As to Daniel Craig, well, he was on his way to James Bond, but as to Layer Cake, there was slight talk of some degree of follow-up, that there was a sequel project called Viva La Madness that Jason Statham's production company was said to have picked up the rights for. The last I heard of that was nearly a decade ago, when it was no longer going to be a film, was going to be a TV show. I think that one has slightly fizzled out. And so Layer Cake pretty much stands as a standalone project, but one that was a springboard to a whole bunch of people for a whole bunch of different reasons. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. Get this as well, you can find more from me on Threads now as well. I'm at simon.brew on that. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories. Not sure for how long the rate Twitter appears to be going. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories online. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, conversations. We've been doing a load of retrospectives of late on Indiana Jones, on Mission Impossible. Lots and lots of writing on that. Some really good comments and responses in there too. And if you head to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find all of our print magazines for sale, as well as our upcoming Blu-ray release too, which I can't announce just yet, but is coming soon. For the minute, you can pick up our Sneakers Blu-ray that's already out there. Finally, the Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. And that's that. I don't think I need to waffle on at you anymore. I think I've comfortably outstayed my welcome, as always. The main thing is that you all stay well, you all stay healthy. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories as I head towards the summer break for the podcast. Until the next time, you all take care, you all look after yourselves. I'll be back soon with some more film stories. Bye-bye.